We're going to move from talking about food as a culture-bound syndrome to talking about a more, also something that is to some degree related to culture and eating, and that is cannibalism. And so I have a nice case study here. This guy is a German guy who thank God for the internet, wanted to eat somebody, and so he put an ad up on Craigslist or some version of Craigslist, and somebody replied to the ad and said, I'm a masochist, and he said, you know, I really want you to eat me. And so this guy said, oh, that's great, because I really want to eat somebody. So we were able to find each other through the internet. And the guy who wants to be eaten says, well, let's start out dinner by, why don't you eat my penis first? And this guy's name is Mize, says, oh, that sounds delicious. And but why don't you cut it off? Oh no, I can't really cut my own penis off. So he cuts it off, sautés it up with some garlic and probably a little white wine. And but it was too chewy. So again, sautés it, garlic, white wine. And then the other guy's kind of passing out from loss of blood because he'd also been given alcohol and painkillers. So this guy leads him upstairs and he's left to bleed to death. After a couple hours, Mize goes up there, finishes him off by slitting his throat, and hangs the body from a meat hook, cuts off chunks and barbecues the meat. And he gets arrested in 2002 because he posted new advertisements to eat people, wanted to eat people. And the police saw these and they decided to search his home, and they videotape, and they found body parts and a videotape of him killing his victims. But what happens? He says, no, look, I've got a signed thing, I've got on video, the guy is agreeing to be killed, he wants to be eaten. So I didn't kill him, I just assisted him in, whatever. And they realized, wow, we really can't arrest him for murder. And so they let him go. So he gets let go for a while. And then, unlike the United States, Germany, where this guy is from, do not have in their constitution a thing about double jeopardy. You guys know about double jeopardy? You can't be tried for the same crime twice. They don't have that in Germany. And so some smart prosecutor went back and said, hey, wait a minute. No, you can arrest him for murder because that guy was not able to give consent because he was mentally ill and or he was also under the influence of alcohol and drugs. So he really was not able to give his consent to be killed. So this is murder. And so they went back and re-arrested him and put him in jail. So again, Germany, no double jeopardy. If he was in America, he'd been off scot-free. Maybe. They probably would have gone for something else. Okay? So he's a good example of a modern-day cannibal, and again, the power of the internet. So please do not do this at home. I do not want to call from the president saying, President Beck calling and saying, Professor Vulcan, one of your students was just found guilty of putting an ad on the internet for somebody to eat. So don't do that, okay? You've been warned. Okay, let's talk a little bit about cannibalism. There are lots of modern examples of cannibalism. I can show you some of these. I don't want to spend a lot of time, so we don't have a lot of time to go, we have a lot of stuff to cover, but just to give you a little idea here. This is a video, it's interesting. The whole video is really interesting. You want to know what the world is going to be like, what the United States is going to be like when all the political parties fragment and people go around the streets, start and shoot each other and belonging to a different warlord. To watch this video. This is the country of Liberia, and which has an interesting history, but this is a war-torn country that people are, that is factionalized to the point where people basically are under the power of different warlords in the country. And so, and some of these warlords feel like they like to eat some of their people who they are fighting with. And so I'll play you a little excerpt from this.
What up, world? Just wanted to say, we love you.
And this guy used to be a general for one of the warlords.
So since there is still time, go back and see how you can repair some of those things.
This guy used to be a general cannibal, and he then became, he followed a guy named General Butt Naked. That was the guy's name. That might be him, I can't remember.
So that is how I take the challenge. You can make a change.
Yeah, he's going to talk about it in a second. But he got converted to Christianity.
Where are we right now? This is the Central Monrovia cemetery.
Cemetery.
After the war, the ex-combatants went into crime and they were looking for hideout. Nowhere for them to stay.
So this is the cemetery where after the war there was nowhere to live. So the people would come in, empty out the graves, and live in the graves. Maybe up to about 4,000 people lived in the graves.
See, all these are empty.
It's a very heavy vibe. Empty graves everywhere. We were just at lunch. We were talking about, we ordered some ribs. And you said, no, I don't like to eat flesh. And I said, why don't you like to eat flesh? And you told me the story about coming back from Nigeria. Could you tell us that story?
Specifically, one time, I was very hungry and I saw the only thing was around was sticks, dry meat. When I took the first bite, I noticed it was human flesh.
Yeah.
So I washed up the pepper to be very sure, washed up the pepper from it to get the taste. And I got the taste, it was human, alarm, and police came and arrested the guy. And I told them, well, I was one of the generals in Liberia, and this is my name, and this is what we did to eat. I ate it several times before, though I'm converted now.
You ate human flesh?
Yeah, a lot of times. So they discovered, so they saw the pictures, and they went to the internet, and they knew that, okay, it's truth.
Yeah. What would you eat?
Some people eat the heart.
Yeah.
Now, for hunger, people eat around here.
Yeah.
And because it's soft or quick to don't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
We're talking about eating human flesh in a graveyard. It's a bit weird.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we can go.
All right, just give you a little excerpt from that. And this is what you're seeing here. This is also factional violence, and I can't remember part of Africa, but these are, can't remember who's who. These are Christians and Muslims, and what happens, there was a guy going through the village, and he was the opposite one. I can't remember if he's a Christian or Muslim. And they pulled him out of the thing, and they beat him, and then they set his body on fire, and this guy's taking pieces of flesh off him and eating it. Okay. If you take my other class, Shameless Plug, Psych 344, Fridays 9 to 11:50 in the fall semester, I'll talk to you about the Gories. I talked to you a little bit about them. I talked about the Sadhus, but they're the guys who live down by the river and eat the flesh of the dead bodies that are cremated there as part of their spiritual practice. And then there's other examples of cannibalism, plenty of other stuff out there, modern versions of cannibalism. Let's take a little detour because you guys know the biologist in me wants to talk about biology. So let's talk a little about cannibalism in the animal kingdom. There's quite a lot of cannibalism in the animal kingdom. Okay? Most fish are cannibals, by the way. Most fish will eat their conspecifics. They'll certainly eat the eggs from their own species, very typical. So fish are a lot. These little biting midges, these will eat each other. You guys we don't have these out here, thank God. Anybody here lived in New England, been in New England in the spring? This time of year in New England, if you go up to New England, up into Maine, these places, they have these things, they call them no-see-ums. And you can't really see them, they're tiny, and they bite you, and the bites are really painful. And they're everywhere. Mother Nature saying how much she hates human beings. So they eat each other. Squirrels and rats. Anybody ever keep a pet mouse or a rat, and you'll know that if they have little babies, and if you go in and touch the babies, the mother will smell your scent on the babies, and many times will eat the babies. You know, she feels like, oh, it's dangerous now. And so what she's doing in this case is trying to recoup the energy she's put into creating those babies by eating them, getting some of that energy back. So you'll see this behavior in squirrels and rats. Sea slugs known to attack and eat each other. Lions will sometimes eat each other. And praying mantises, of course, this is part of sex. So the male will mount the female, and while his body is vigorously thrusting in copulation, she will reach around and basically bite off his head, and then his body will continue to copulate with her while she takes the head like a nice ripe melon and chomps away at it. This is very common in praying mantises. Other animals, spiders are very interesting in this. There's many spiders that will also do this, where the female will eat the male during sex or after sex. And it's interesting because in spiders, you can see this, you can see the evolution of this, because you have some spider species where they haven't fully evolved to do this. So this gives some sort of advantage, right? This behavior persists because it confers a fitness advantage. Those praying mantises who were able to eat the heads of their partners, were able to have more offspring, and therefore through natural selection that behavior has been chosen for. In spiders, you can actually find intermediates. You can find species where the males sometimes get eaten and sometimes the males get away. They don't want to get eaten. Sometimes they get away and sometimes they don't. And so you can find in spiders everything from spiders that don't do this to spiders where it sometimes happens to spiders where it happens all the time. It's really quite fascinating. And so again, when you can see those things, it's almost like the fossil record, right? When you can see intermediate stages, this really gives you a strong sense or strong evidence that this is a behavior that's evolved due to fitness. Fitness, in a certain sort of ecological niche, right? So it's really quite fascinating. So spiders should add spiders in here too. They're really very interesting. Okay. We also see cannibalism among primates. Jane Goodall, who is very famous for studying chimpanzees, noticed female chimps killing and eating the offspring of other females. Right? So you don't like that. You have a kid. Maybe your kid is up for being head cheerleader, and so what you do is and she's competing against some other lady's kids. So you go and take that kid out, right? And so this is actually a real true case that happened. There was a lady in Texas, I think in Texas, where they take sports very seriously. This woman had a daughter who was up for head cheerleader, and she had a rival who was competing with her for it, and I think the mom put like a hit out on the other kid or something, right? So just imagine if she just put the hit out on that kid and then ate the kid, it'd be primate, right? So this is very primate behavior, okay? There's some speculation here that there's a direct correlation between the status and the ability to keep offspring alive related to cannibalism. Thought that acts of cannibalism are an attempt to remove competition for their own offsprings. Now we know male chimps, I told you before, are prone to infanticide, killing off another male's progeny. So the female will then go into heat and mate with them and have their offspring, but they're not necessarily eating those things they're killing. Okay? Infanticide documented in over 50 species. Again, so a lot of the stuff I already told you. Okay? Origins of cannibalism. Well, we don't really know. That's the bottom line. So archaeological evidence of cannibalism among Neanderthals that lived 250,000 to 30,000 BCE. By the way, when did modern hominids, Homo sapiens, when were they around in the picture? When are our oldest ancestors around? Modern Homo sapiens. Should know this. No. That's right. Probably about 200,000 BC. Somewhere in there. And then other people argue that we didn't behaviorally become modern humans probably until 20,000 to 6,000 BC with the rise of agriculture. Because agriculture changed our behavior quite a bit. Before that, we were probably hunter-gatherers, and we're a different kind of lifestyle. Okay? So when we say Neanderthals are around 250,000 years to 30,000 years, there's lots of time for overlap with human beings, and somebody looked that up. Did I get that wrong? Modern Homo sapiens, I think 200,000 years, but it could be 20,000. I might have misplaced a zero.
I think it's 20,000.
Somebody look it up. I think it's 200,000, but look it up. So anyway, but the point is a lot of overlap with Neanderthals. So much, and so that overlap was not just like fighting each other, killing and eating each other. That was also some little sexual contact there. Okay, so that's why we all have a little bit of Neanderthal DNA that we carry with us, and a little Neanderthal DNA.
200,000.
And Denovian, 200,000. I was right. Good. Good. My memory's still going. All the coffee and vegetarian diet is keeping my memory going. Okay, so a lot of overlap with Neanderthals, also the Denisovanes, whatever I can't pronounce it, are around in this time too, so some overlap. So some evidence of cannibalism, how they get evidence, they look at bones and they can see these marks on the bones and they can say this looks like somebody sort of chopping the meat off this so they could eat it, right? And so a lot of the evidence for this kind of stuff comes from bone stuff, okay? And again, we also see Homo sapiens in the Neolithic period, 10,000 to 9,500 BC. This is again before agriculture, and even into the Bronze Age when we had agriculture. Okay, and we can see supposedly some evidence from the bones, crushed skulls that expose the brain, facial mutilation, burnt bones, dismemberment, cut marks, bone breakage, hammerstone abrasions where they're hammering it, missing vertebrae, etc. Very circumstantial, far from conclusive. Okay, but this is what people who study this have made some of these conclusions, and again, some people disagree. Okay. Now, when we get into more recent times, still a long time ago, we have lots of stories and myths revolving around cannibalism, and some of the Greek myths are some of the best ones, and there's a lot of these Greek myths that revolve around cannibalism. Okay? And in fact, if Freud had maybe been around a lot longer, he might have been looking at some of these cannibal myths and maybe revising his psychology. Okay, so one of the main ones is the myth of Kronos. Kronos was a titan, and the titans, were sort of before the gods were there, sort of the uber gods. And Kronos was the head of all the titans, and there was a prophecy that one day he'd have a son who would overpower him. And being the kind of unresolved Oedipal complex person he was, he didn't want his son to compete with him. So therefore, every time his wife Rhea had a baby, he would swallow the baby whole to keep that thing, a male baby, to keep that from happening. Okay? This angered Gaia, who was, one of these titans. So when the youngest son, Zeus, was born, Gaia took a stone, wrapped it in swaddling clothes, and offered it to Kronos to swallow. Kronos didn't notice the substitution, and Gaia was able to spirit the baby Zeus away to be raised in Crete, far away from his competitive father. And you know this story. Zeus grows up, comes home, gets into immediate conflict with the tyrant Kronos, who doesn't know that the newcomer is his own son. Zeus needed his brothers and sisters to help in slaying the tyrant. I guess Kronos also ate the daughters too, because why not? And so what he did is he got Zeus, he gave something, an emetic to Kronos to get him to throw up, and he threw up all the brothers and sister gods, and then they all bound together, the gods led by Zeus, and they overthrew Kronos. Okay? And then they made Mount Olympus and decided to go live in Mount Olympus, and then that's how the Olympian gods came to be. Okay? Another story, another Greek myth, Tantalus, who was a son of Zeus. Zeus liked to come down and, how can I put this nicely, do it with human women and father lots of children. And so there's lots of these kids out there who are half God and half human, right? Lots of these guys out there. So Tantalus was one of these guys. He was the king of a place called Sipylus. He was favored among mortals since he was invited to share the food of the gods. However, he abused his guest-host relationship and was punished by being what we call tantalized with hunger and thirst in a place called Tartarus, where he's immersed up into his neck in water, but when he bends to drink, the water drains away. There's luscious fruit in the trees above him, but when he reaches for the fruit, the wind blows the branches away. So everything is, the food and the drink are just out of reach. This is where our word being tantalized comes from. Okay? Now, there's different stories about Tantalus' crime. One account was that he tried to share the divine ambrosia with other mortals. You go up to Olympus, they serve you this great divine ambrosia that makes you live forever. And he stole some of it, and he tried to share it with the mortals. That's a crime. The other account, which is more interesting to our discussion, is that he invited the gods to a banquet. And at this banquet, he decided, I'm going to serve them something special. So he takes his own son, Pelops, and he kills him, chops him up, and cooks him up, and serves the gods human flesh. Now, the gods do not like this. When they discover the trick, they tantalize him, and the gods have a sort of they're gods, right? So they have a sort of perceptual power. So the food's put in front of them, and they all sort of notice there's something wrong with this food, and they wouldn't eat it, except for one who was Demeter. Demeter is distracted by something. I don't know. She's thinking about something else. She's picked the food and eats a little bit of piece of shoulder, right? And so the gods are really pissed off. So they send Tantalus to his torture here forever, and then they feel very bad. So what they do is they restore Pelops, but they don't have the little part of his shoulder that Demeter ate. So they put a little piece of ivory there, right? And they restore him. So that's another story. Of course, Tantalus' family was ill-fated. His daughter Niobe lost all her children, was turned to stone. His son Pelops was murdered, cooked, and restored to life. He had two grandsons, Atreus and Thyestes, who struggled for power, and Atreus commits a variation of Tantalus' cannibalistic trick with Thyestes' children. So the uncle kills the other kids and serves them up as a power thing. So again, if you want to read more Greek myths, these are really quite fascinating, but lots of cannibalism. You can read that. I won't read you the Atreus and Thyestes myth, but you can read this. There used to be a saying called a Thyestean feast, and this would mean a feast at which which human flesh is served. Okay? So I'll let you guys read the rest of this on your own. Also from Ovid in Metamorphosis, other stories about cooking up people. Lots of this in Greek myths. So just tons of cannibal stories in Greek myths. And if you read my book, shameless plug, it's in the library, by the way. Also available for free online. The digital version is now free online. If you want a summer reading, you can read my book for free online. Yay! I talk about the myth of Dionysus. Dionysus and his followers were the Maenads, who would they're these women who live this pure life, wearing only clean white clothing and only drinking the purest water and eating only vegetables and living this life devoted to Dionysus, worshiping him. But then Dionysus would come on a feast day, festival day, and they would drink wine, because Dionysus is the god of wine, and these women would drink wine. The Maenads would then drink wine and become drunk and go into a frenzy, and then any man they saw, they would fall upon him and rip his flesh with their fingers and their teeth and eat him, and especially one part of the flesh they liked over the other. And you can imagine what that part was, in which they would eat. So, you can read all about it in my book. Available for free. And all you have to do is go online, freepsychotherapiebooks.org or .com, and just search for my name and you'll find it. There's a quote from my book. You have to quote yourself, huh? Okay. I'll let you guys read this. Okay. So, cannibalism around the world. There has been in recent years a resurgence of interest in interpretations of cannibalism from archaeological evidence. In other words, what's happened is archaeologists and other people looking at this stuff are now starting to take some of this evidence that was presented before for cannibalism with a grain of salt. Remember I told you that people were using bones to suggest cannibalism? Some people were like, yeah, I'm not quite sure that's what's going on. But in other cases, the cannibalism seems like it's highly likely. Okay. We think cannibalism has been found in places like the southwest of the United States, from the Anasazi culture. We think that there's been cannibalism in Africa, Australia, East and Southeast Asia, New Zealand, Middle East, and some Pacific islands. Motivations for cannibalism have varied, but it's thought to have occurred regularly throughout human existence. Even though maybe it's not everywhere and at all times, it seems like it's periodically shows up as something that gets practiced in different places around the world throughout different times. These are woodcuts. This is a woodcut of the Carib Indians, who are in what we would now call the Caribbean. Okay, and the Carib Indians were thought to practice cannibalism, and especially they would go to war with some other tribe. They would take prisoners. I told you about the men would be castrated to fatten them up, and they would then kill them and eat them. And here's a picture woodcut. Supposedly these were made by when the Spanish came. They saw these guys doing this stuff. And I think this is a little bit stylized, but this is the idea that they'd be eating people. There's some evidence for this. Well, let's talk about different kinds of cannibalism now. Okay. Oh, I should mention too. I want to mention before I go on here. One thing that archaeologists and anthropologists, psychologists, whoever study this stuff, they've become a little more wary of is ascribing cannibalism to people just sort of on scant evidence. And the problem for this is because cannibalism can provide an excuse for people colonizing other people. In other words, you go in, you take over a bunch of the people, you colonize them, maybe you enslave them, and this is not a good thing, and at some point people know this is really not a good thing for the people, so they justify it, they rationalize it. One of the rationalizations is, well, we had to come in here and take over these people because they're cannibals. They're just eating each other, it's disgusting. And it goes against, the will of God, and so what we need to do is we need to stop this behavior, we'll stop them from doing this, we'll convert them to Christianity, and then we're really doing them a favor. And so, the label of cannibalism becomes sort of something that rationalizes, the subjugation of a people. And so again, when people are labeled as cannibals, we have to be very careful about this because it's easy to say, oh, these people, they're cannibals, so it's okay for us to come in and enslave them, right? And this again, what a lot of Western powers did, especially in places like the Caribbean. So we got to take some of this stuff with a grain of salt. Theoretically, the Caribbean, they actually saw this stuff going on, but again, how widespread it was, how common it was, we take a little with a grain of salt. Okay? Let's talk about different kinds of cannibalism. So the first time we should talk about is EXO Cannibalism. And EXO Cannibalism is where a culture or group consumes another people from another culture and group. In other words, they consume people from outside their own group. This form of cannibal practice is often associated with war, murder, aggression, tribal power, and the acquisition of individual power through absorbing the spirit and skills of those who are consumed. Also can be used as an insult to the other group. So this is typical kind of exo-cannibalism is my tribe goes and fights your tribe. We fight it out. I beat you. Like, well, you were a pretty good warrior, so I take your heart out. I eat your heart and I get your power as a warrior. But I also insult you. Because what happens when I eat you? Turn into poop. So I'm turning into poop. It's the ultimate insult, right? Yeah, I got your power and I'm turning you into poop. Ultimate insult, right? So again, this would be kind of where you typically see exo-cannibalism. Mm-hmm. It could be not a war. Maybe our tribes are warring with each other, and so I send some people in, I kidnap you, and bring you back, kill you, and we eat you. So it could be kind of a murder kind of thing. But this is typically exo-cannibalism. So tribal power, aggression going on here. Okay? And again, lots of cases of this. I'll tell you about one in a minute. Endocannibalism. Endocannibalism is the consumption of members of one's own culture or group or tribe, often associated with funerary rites, part of a funeral, ritual ceremony surrounding the death of people within a culture or group or tribe. It's been called compassionate cannibalism or mortuary cannibalism. Okay? And many scholars believe this type of cannibalism to have been more widespread than exo-cannibalism because it doesn't require murdering people. The person's already died. And focuses on eating people who are already dead. And it's used to show respect for those who have died, to absorb their spirit and power. So again, remember I talked to you about tattoos? How, a lot of tattoos are sort of related to grieving a person, right? And so what you do is you inscribe those person, on your body, and then you get to take them with you. Well, funerary cannibalism may have some similar psychological dynamics, where my father died, I love my father, and so what I'm going to do is I'm going to eat some of his brains, and therefore I'm going to absorb his power and his wisdom, and that'll be with me forever. Because then we know when we eat food, that food goes to make up our body and nurture us. And so I'm really being nurtured, final nurturing, by my father, right? And I absorb his power, and this is an homage to him, right? And I get to keep him with me forever. Okay? So this is endocannibalism. Endocannibalism.
I have a question.
Yeah.
If a a culture does one, are they more likely to do the other or not to do?
Good question. In some places, the answer is yes, especially in places like Papua New Guinea. Papua New Guinea, you find people doing both, but not always. Some places they do one or the other. If it's an insult, you're not going to do this, right? You're not going to do Indo-cannibalism. You don't insult your father by eating him, right? Turning him into poop. So if you're one of those people, probably not going to. But in places like New Guinea, you can find instances of both. They're not mutually exclusive. Coexist in some places. And again, good question. You segued perfectly into the slide. In Papua New Guinea, where there's mixed Indo and EXO cannibalism. And in Papua New Guinea, cannibalism existed probably, as far as we know, into the 1960s. Might still be going on there because New Guinea is probably one of the most unexplored places on the face of the planet. It's very difficult to get to the interior jungle. And so there, we don't know there may be tribes there that we don't even know about yet. And supposedly some tribes in New Guinea also practiced exocannibalism for the most part for another reason. And that was because they really enjoyed the taste of how shall we call it, the other white meat, right? Which was humans. And supposedly for taste, and there's a story from New Guinea about a tribe. I have it here. Where is it? Okay, so I'll just tell you the story. So the story goes like this. One day, a hunting party goes out from the tribe. The men go out on a hunting party. The women stay behind. The men go out on a hunting party. And they go into the jungle, and they have a successful hunting trip. They come back. They're feeling really good. They're singing songs. They're feeling good about themselves. They have killed a couple pigs, wild boars. And they're bringing these back for the tribe. They're feeling like, yeah, we're men, great hunters. And they come back in the tribe, and the women are there. And as they come in, the women are looking at them and going, "You call that meat? That's not the meat they want. That's not the meat we want. We want the good stuff." And the men know what they're talking about, and they're very downcast. "But look, we got these fine pigs." "No, that's crap food. We want the real stuff." And the men then change their mood. They become very downtrodden, and they go back out, and they raid another village, and they take a captive, and they bring him back, and they kill him, and the women are like, "That's what we're talking about." And they cook the guy up, and they eat him, and the women are really happy, and the guys are kind of like, yeah. Why would the guys be like, yeah, not so great?
Because they have to go out and fight people.
Yeah, because they may come and attack them and eat one of them, right? So that's a story supposedly from this tribe in New Guinea. Supposedly taste played a role here. They really like the taste of human meat. Who knows? One thing that is found, came along with cannibalism, that was discovered in New Guinea, is something called kuru. Kuru as distinct from koro. Right? Remember koro? Talked about last week? The delusion that your penis is retracting into the body. Different than kuru. And this was kuru was first seen in 1954 when an Australian patrol officer observed a young girl from the Foray tribe who exhibited uncontrollable shaking and violent jerking. By 1955, medical professionals began to study the syndrome, but conventional methods to find either bacterial or viral causes turned up nothing. In 1959, a veterinarian noticed the similarities between kuru and a disease called scrapie, which is a disease in sheep. A sample of brains from people who died of kuru were injected into chimps who then developed the disease, so they know it's something that's contagious. Eventually, the practice was traced back to the relatively recent practice where these people would practice Indo-cannibalism and eat the brains of the recently deceased. So my dad died, my mom died, show respect to her, we're going to internalize her by eating her brains. But her brains carried something we know to be now that's not either a virus or a bacteria, it's a prion. And a prion is an abnormally folded protein that is contagious. When this abnormally folded protein comes into contact with a regularly folded protein, it causes the regularly folded protein to fold abnormally. And this is where we get diseases such as scrapie and mad cow disease, you may have heard of. And in human beings, this is called Creutzfeldt-Jacobs disease, something like that, or in New Guinea, Kuru. So this is the prion disease. And what was going on is that people were eating the brains of people who have been infected with this. And by the way, prion infections can take decades before they manifest. But if you eat the brains of somebody and you're getting a lot of it, you can certainly, you can get it more quickly. And so they were eating the brains of people who had this, and then they were acquiring the disease through eating it. Okay? So this is a disease you can acquire through eating infected meat. All right? This is a problem. Back in, I don't know, it was the 80s or so, in Britain, there was some meat, beef with mad cow disease. Some cows with mad cow disease, their meat got into the food chain, and people unknowingly ate this meat. And the idea is that sometimes it can maybe take 20 or 30 years for the prion disease to manifest. And so people are still wondering whether or not we're going to see some people in Britain, and that little mini epidemic of people who ate meat at that time, developing this sort of mad cow disease. So that may happen. We don't know. But in New Guinea, it happened quite regularly. And then when they got people to stop eating the brains of other people, stop eating the other people for endocannibalism, Kuru stopped. And they didn't know what it was for a long time because they didn't know how to detect prion disease. They had no idea what it was. But then now we know what it is. Okay? Also, if you eat wild game, if you go out and shoot deer, you may end up eating something, because we know that this prion disease exists in populations of animals out in the wild. And so this is also a risk of eating wild game. Okay? Is it a big risk? Probably not a big risk, but it's definitely non-zero. And there's other risks you can get from eating wild game besides that one. But that's one of the ones that's pretty heavy. Okay? Let's talk a little bit about religious cannibalism. Both Indo and EXO cannibalism have been associated with religious practices. I think you've kind of seen a little bit of that. Many cultures had cannibalism as part of religion. And most of these religions and their associated cannibalistic practices were abolished by the spread of Christianity. And this is true in places like New Guinea, Fiji, the Caribbean, etc., etc. And ironically, Christianity has symbolic cannibalism, right? Anybody here Catholic? No offense if you're Catholic, but you guys know what it is. When you go up to get the cookie, right? What was that? What do they say? The cookie?
The
body of Christ, right? And then the wine is the blood of Christ. So symbolically, you are engaging in a cannibalistic feast in your church. No offense. It's a symbolic thing, right? But again, the idea is you internalize, psychologically, you're internalizing the qualities of Jesus, these kind of things, right? So it makes sense psychologically, but at least it's symbolic. Okay? So it's interesting that Christianity symbolic cannibalism drove out a lot of the actual cannibalism. One of the oldest myths found in human cultures relates to sacrifice. So if you take my other classes, like my 344 class, I'll talk a little bit about the myth of sacrifice. It's very interesting. Many early religions practiced some form of sacrifice, including human sacrifices. And the idea of the sacrifice is something must be lost or given up in order to continue the cycle of the world. In other words, the world, you want the sun to come up tomorrow, it means you need to sacrifice something. And human life being most valuable is the thing that is the most valuable sacrifice and is the most strongest thing to keep the continuation of the world going. And so you'll find a lot of cultures will have this thing that's sacrificed of great value being human life. Okay? And these kind of sacrifices carry lots of power. By the way, this is an excellent book, The Myth of Eternal Return by Mercier Eliade. I highly recommend it. It talks a lot about this kind of stuff. Sacrifice also may play a role in allowing humans to return from the profane world to the sacred world. So this is part of the religious thing, right? We live in a profane world, the everyday reality, and we want to get to that sacred reality, depending on the religion, whatever that might be. And one way we can get to that sacred reality is through giving up something, again, of great value, through a sacrifice. And so human sacrifice can allow a temporary return to the sacred. Okay? And ingesting that sacrifice can allow profane humans the opportunity to incorporate something of the sacred. And again, this would be an example of the Catholic Church and having the body of Christ and the wafer and the drinking the blood of the wine is the blood of Jesus, right? So same idea. I'm going to let you guys read the story on your own. This is a story from Nigeria. let you read that on your own. Let's talk a little bit about religious sacrifice. Something is relatively close by to us from Mexico is the ancient Aztecs. And they're a good example of the use of cannibalism for religious purposes. Though the practice may have had some other uses as well, and some of these other uses are a little controversial. We'll talk a little bit about that. To some degree, the Aztec rituals of cannibalism follow the myth of the eternal return and allow the ancient Aztecs to maintain a balance between the sacred and profane, and also to keep the sun coming up every day. So these sacrifices had to be done to guarantee that the sun would rise in the morning and that our reality would continue. Okay? Aztec were thought to have sacrificed and eaten many thousands of human beings throughout their history. The ritual cannibalism was done on a yearly cycle, and the Aztecs ate both people from their own group, their own group, Indo-cannibalism, as well as outsiders, EXO Cannibalism. Some writers believe the Aztecs gained important nutritional support from the practice of cannibalism, though this view is contested by other writers. A very good book on this, you can read this. By sacrificing humans in a specific ritualistic fashion, Aztecs believed they could maintain the continuity of the world. Failing to perform sacrifices would result in the end of the world and the destruction of everyone. So cannibalism was also a religious act which allowed those partaking of the flesh to gain divine powers through communication with the gods. Cannibalism also used to thank the gods for success in battle or a good harvest. And it may be that human flesh was also used as a supplemental protein source by the Aztecs. And this is a depiction of Aztec sacrifice. So what happened was the Spanish came over, they saw the Aztecs, they actually saw some of the stuff going on, they saw some of these rituals, and then they actually wrote down and drew pictures of what was going on. And so this is a typical Aztec thing. You take the guy up to the top of the temple, top of the pyramid, and as the sun rises, then they stab into the heart, they cut into the heart and pull out the still beating, living heart of the person, and that's the sacrifice. So the Spanish saw this, supposedly wrote about it. But not all scholars agree about the Aztecs' need for supplemental protein. So this is contested. And there's a great article of Montalano. I don't know if I gave you guys just to read Aztec Cannibalism and Ecological Necessity, where he went back and he found these records that the Spanish left and analyzed these. And these records had how much food, what was going on during these times, during these years. And he looked at this and he said, no, that didn't seem like they were having any problem with having enough protein. It seemed like they had plenty. And so we really don't think that Aztec cannibalism really was probably a protein supplement. They didn't need to eat people, for protein. That they had other protein sources. So this is the article that sort of analyzes stuff and looks at this. Okay, here's another one of these codex things that these guys saw of these sacrifices. These were written by the Spanish. You can see the guy down here having a little tasty bite here on his sword shish kebab. In reality, what happened with a lot of the Aztec sacrifices is that there was really a great symbolic value to this. And I can talk a little bit about this. The accounts of Aztec sacrifice recorded by Spanish explorers in the 1400s and 1500s. One account comes from something that's called the Ramirez Codex. Another partially native account comes from a guy named Juan Bautista de Pomar, who was the grandson of a high-ranking Aztec, but also was partly Spanish. Accounts are very similar in description. Some key points of the sacrifice ritual are thus. Aztec warriors received the body of the victim, boiled it to separate the flesh from the bones. This is after it's been sacrificed. Meat from the body would then be cut up into little pieces. And these little pieces were then sent to important people, even from other towns, and the recipient would rarely eat the meat. It was considered an honor to get some meat, but the meat had no value by itself. The warrior sending out the meat would usually receive something from the recipient in return: jewels, fancy blankets, feathers, slaves, etc. The tribute was to encourage successful warriors. There were only 2 ceremonies a year when war captives were sacrificed. Okay? So there's not a lot of evidence that cannibalism was as widespread as people used to think among the Aztecs. Interestingly, the Aztecs believed that there were man-eating tribes in South Mexico, and they thought those people ate people to keep from starving. So it may have been there's some confusion between those two things, two groups. Now imagine this thing so let's say you are a big sports star. Let's say pick a guy who's really big in sports. LeBron James. We love LeBron. LeBron James. And so what I do is, you know, we win the championship, you know, and then a human is sacrificed, boiled, cut up, and as LeBron James, I get a big chunk of meat because I'm the champion, right? And then what I do is, I've got all these, let's say, Instagram followers. I take a little piece of meat, I cut it up, I send it to all of my Instagram followers. If you've got a piece of meat from LeBron James, that is a huge honor for you. Directly, LeBron James gave you a piece of human flesh, right? And so what you do is, oh man, LeBron, I like you so much, man, you're so awesome. I'm now going to go out and buy your tennis shoes, or I'm going to send you some money, or I'm going to send you some jewels, right? So that's kind of how the Aztec system worked. The warriors were like the LeBron James, you know, of the time, right? They were like the sort of superstars. Right, so that's kind of how it worked. So probably the meat eating had more of a symbolic value. The meat had more symbolic value than it had nutritional value. Does that make sense? Okay, good. And here you go. You can see him cutting the guy open, putting him in the pot, etc., etc., etc. Let's move to New Guinea again. And this is the story I told you already about the taste of human meat, so I'm not going to go over that again. But a lot of our early information about New Guinea comes from missionaries, and so again, this is both great and also problematic. Okay. And again, there's some cases where some of the missionaries who worked in places like New Guinea become victims of the very practices that they devote their lives to attempting to eradicate. But they were very successful in dealing with cannibalism in New Guinea, and probably the Kuru helped with that. Okay. And so this is a case of missionary Reverend James Chalmer, and who asked some New Guineans why they ate human flesh. He was told it was the women of the tribes who first urged the men to kill their fellow human beings for the purpose of eating them. And again, I told you that story about returning from the hunt. So again, here we're going to blame the women. And again, if you're a Christian, especially old school Christian, this makes sense because we know women are the source of original sin, right? Eve was the problem, not Lilith, right? Lilith was like, yeah, screw you, I'm out of here, you know. But Eve basically was like, well, had to sort of, you know, stick around with Adam, and of course was the source of original sin because she eats the apple, and probably then wishes she had gone off with Lilith. Who knows? Okay. But again, you know, you got to take this with a grain of salt that this is Reverend is interviewing these New Guineans, and then of course, you know, it's very convenient to blame the cannibalism on women. Okay. I don't know that women are more cannibalistic than men. I have not seen that, but again, I have not seen among at least you guys a bunch of cannibals. So that's hopefully that will continue to be the case. Okay. There's people also called them again. Written by one of these early guys from New Guinea, the Mafulu people. Supposedly have always been cannibals and are still so, subject now to the fear which they hold, the controlling authority of the white man, which impels them, such of them, are in close touch with the latter, to indulge in their practice only in secrecy. Wow, that's really a convoluted sentence. That's how they wrote back in the 1900s. The cannibalism has been and is, however, of a restricted character. They do not kill for the purpose of eating. They only kill the bodies of people who have been intentionally killed, not the bodies who have been killed by people by accident or died a natural death. Also, the victim eaten is always a member of another community. So here's the case of these New Guineans who practice EXO Cannibalism. Killing is followed by eating. It's always a hostile killing in a fight, but this fight may be either personal or an individual, or it may be a battle. The idea of eating the body appears to be a continued act of hostility rather than one of gastronomic enjoyment, and I could learn nothing of any belief as to acquiring the valor or power of the deceased by eating him. I was informed that the man who has killed the victim never will himself share in the eating of him. Okay? So this is very interesting. This is a tribe that goes out, kills people in individual battle or combat, but not to gain the valor or the power of the person they killed, but basically to insult them as an act of hostility. And the person doing the killing does not partake. So that's a very interesting sort of variation of this. Okay? And of course, again, you see the racist stuff here, that it's the white man who comes in here and, you know, is saving these people from this practice that they're doing, and the white man is the civilizing influence. Again, a very racist, condescending attitude that you find in a lot of these early writings. I mentioned to you the religious agories of India, and again, this is an early account, but again, the idea that these guys go down to the riverbanks when there's a funeral, And when the funeral's over, the meat's not completely burnt up, and so they take pieces of meat from the pier and they eat them. And the idea here again is to get rid of this sort of duality between good and bad, or to be, you know, to become close to God. You must live like God, and so therefore you have no moral compunctions about what you're doing. So you eat, drink, you know, you eat human flesh, you do all these kind of things. And this is kind of the Agori sort of philosophy. And so you want to learn more about the Agori, shameless plug, take my Psych 344 class, and I'll talk a little bit more about them and talk a little more about sadhus in general. And here's this guy, an American Agori. It's an American who goes over to India and becomes an Agori. And his name is Kapal Nath. And he becomes lost in a lifestyle of grave robbing and cannibalizing the bodies to consume the Shakti, the life energy of the dead. Right? So there you go. Supposedly he's free now. He's freed his spirit as an Agori. So again, do not go and do this. Last thing I need is President Beck coming and saying, you know, by the way, one of your students went to India and became an Agori, and now we're blaming it on you. Don't try this at home. All right, let's talk about another kind of cannibalism, survival cannibalism. This one is very close to my heart because as a young man growing up in California, I, like many of you guys, was in middle school, or probably middle school, and we had to read about the exploits of the Donner Party. So you guys should all know about this. It's part of, I think everybody's required to take California history, right? So this is one of the pivotal things in California history that, for whatever reason, in middle school or high school, they like to point this out. The Donner Party are a party of settlers who were coming to California. And, you know, the settlers back in the day, we didn't have highways. You couldn't just take Highway 80 and cruise in over the mountains. You know, that you had your wagon train carried by oxen or whatever, and you would come from somewhere in the east or the Middle West, and you make this long, arduous journey through these basically like, you know, basically through the wilderness. There were roads, there were trails, but there were really no roads. And you had to time your journey just right. Because if you started off, you know, in a certain time period, you know, you wanted to make sure that you would get to California when it was still warm out. Because the Sierra Nevada mountains are very high and they get a lot of snow. Typically, in typical year, they get a lot of snow. And we've had a lot of years now where they haven't got a lot of snow. This year they got a lot of snow. So if you want to see what it's like for the Donner Party, you can now go up, still before it all melts, go up to, you know, Reno, drive to Reno up on Highway 80, and you can go to the pass there. And what's the pass called?
Donner Pass.
Donner Pass. And you can see the snow. You know, I remember going up as a kid, the snow was 20 feet. There was a lot of snow up there. Okay. So the Donner Party are going there. They don't have modern cars. They don't have floating couches with engines that have heaters in them. They don't have, you know, food. You know, whatever they can bring with them in these primitive wagons, and they mistime their journey. And so what happens is they get to Nevada, they get to the top of the pass, and then they get snowed in. They get snowed in, they get stuck. They can't move. They're there with their animals. They end up having to eat their animals. Then they have to eat their shoes, which are made of leather. They boil the leather down into kind of a jelly stuff. They eat that. People start dying, and then they start eating the people, because otherwise they're going to starve to death, right? So they basically, you know, and I think more than half died. A lot of people died. A big chunk of them died. After the winter's over, the survivors are eventually, or the survivors are eventually rescued. About half the group, 46 survivors, they're eventually rescued. They were very upfront about what they needed to do to survive. I'm going to tell you why they're upfront about this, because there was a tradition of survival cannibalism that already existed in the world at the time. I'll tell you about that in a minute. So they said, no, we had to eat dead bodies to survive. It was horrible. They brought them down to the Bay Area, I think, somewhere down in California, and they said, oh no, you guys did cannibalism, you're criminals, and we're going to charge you with murder. And they were regarded as murderers, and they were sentenced to prison time. And the survivors served about 6 months in prison. And they were let out, and they were constantly like stigmatized by this. And so you can read this. It's a very good book on the Donner Party. I recommend this one. There's lots of books on the Donner Party. I recommend that one. It's more of the gritty detail than you might have got in middle school. Because when I was in middle school, we never learned that the survivors were put in jail. I don't know, you guys knew that? I didn't know that. They never talk about that part. They got put in jail. So, you know, but they were let out. They didn't serve too long in jail, but they had to serve some jail time. So moral of the story, if you're driving up to Reno in the winter, make sure you got chains in your car. All-wheel drive, four-wheel drive is best. Make sure your heater's working, and make sure you pack lots of beef jerky in the trunk, just in case you get stuck there. Okay? Now, I was really obsessed about this when I was in high school, and I had a friend of mine who was really obsessed with riding rails like a hobo. My weird friends. And so what we would do is we would go up to Donner Pass and camp there, and there's a place where the train tracks go there, and the train has to slow down, and it's a great place if you want to hop a train. So we would go up there and camp out, and he would hop trains and ride them up and then ride them back. This was, I don't know why you want to do that. It's my crazy friend, who's now became very, very, very religious. Very interesting. So we would camp up there at the Donner Party, near where the Donner Party was probably camped for the winter. And so I think I absorbed a lot of that Donner Party mojo. I always wondered a little bit, I'll confess you, I always wondered a little bit what human flesh must have tasted like. Now, I'm not a ghoul, so I haven't gone out and tried any human flesh. But there was, for a time, a guy who was, I think he was an anthropologist, and he was marketing a human flesh substitute. And so he was going to use this in classes to get people to eat some human flesh to get what it tastes like. And it was made out of, he invented this stuff that was a human flesh substitute that was made, I think it was made out of tofu. But it was supposed to have the same texture and a little bit of the taste of human flesh. And he was marketing it for a while, and I tried to get some because I wanted to, I figured to make this part of the class more interesting to hand out. I wouldn't even tell you guys. I go, well, we should all try a little human flesh, right? And give you some. But he went out of business. So unfortunately, we can't do that. I think I should write him and get the recipe. Maybe I could figure out how to do it. But anyway, so you don't get to try human flesh. That part on the pass there, Donner Pass, a very beautiful place to go camping if you ever want to go camping. I assume it's still the same. It's been a long time since. Yes.
So I actually have a family friend who their ancestors were part of the Donner.
Oh.
Not the ones that were eaten, but the ones that actually went out to go seek help.
Oh, okay. Yeah, right. Because some of them left to go get help.
Yeah.
Come back.
So, like, I always talk to them about it, and like,
Yeah.
we don't want to talk about that.
Yeah, we don't want to talk about that. Yeah, they probably heard enough of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Very interesting. Very interesting. So anyway, I feel a really strong connection to the Donner Party. I don't know, just some crazy kid who grew up in California. When I was a kid, I just thought this was really the most interesting thing in the world. I don't know. I watched a lot of zombie movies as a kid too, so maybe that's something to do with it. Okay, let's talk about some other survival cannibalism. Something happened more recently in the Andes Mountains in 1972. There was a group of rugby players from Chile, and they were with their entourage, and their jet crashed in the Andes Mountain. Initially, 13 out of the 45 people died in the crash, with more people dying later from their injury and from exposure. You know, it's very cold up in the Andes Mountains. Very high up. Survivors reported to cannibalizing the dead. And those who refused to eat the dead themselves soon died of starvation and exposure, and then they were eaten. 16 survivors were rescued after 70 days. In this case, they were not prosecuted for their cannibalistic behavior. And they made a movie from this, and you can still find this movie somewhere. It might even be on YouTube. I haven't looked for it recently. Called Alive, and they made a story about this. So this is a more recent version of this. You know, back in the 70s, they probably didn't have as good tracking devices. They didn't have GPS, things like that. Nowadays, I think this would be probably over land, even pretty remote land. This would probably be unlikely to happen because we have GPS things and all sorts of stuff, and cell phones and all sorts of things. So I don't think it's happening. It could still happen maybe over water. We'll talk about that in a minute, but they made a movie about this. Now, this was such an inspiring movie that some brilliant reality TV producer decided, you know what, we should make a reality show out of this. And so they made a series using British celebrities called Alive, Back to the Andes. And what they did is they took a bunch of British celebrities and they basically had them recreate what the people in the Andes did for survival. Basically like sitting in the snow naked and, you know, blah, 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 eating fake human food, all these kind of things. And they follow the footsteps of two men who survived the mountains by eating the flesh of those who died in the crash before embarking on a hazardous journey over the Argentinian peaks to Chile in search of help. The four celebrities who recreated the journey supposedly had expertise of a mountain guide. They had a tent, they had mountaineering gear, But they were given raw meat to eat during this show to sort of mimic the eating of the human flesh. And I have not been able to see this yet. It's British. I have not been able to see this yet, but I'm dying to watch this show. So you guys know my love for reality television. Combine that with cannibalism. What could be better TV than that? So I'm looking for this, and hopefully one day I'll find it, and maybe I'll be able to show you some clips in class. But this has just got to be one of the best things ever done. Right? The only better reality show than this is my other idea, which I have now told people in Hollywood they should do this, and that is to take these people who believe in the flat earth and follow them out. They're going on this expedition to the end of the earth to follow them out with TV cameras. And I told my brother-in-law this, who's a TV producer, and he said, I will pay for the expedition to follow those guys. That's going to be the best TV ever. Right? Now, if they're only adding a little cannibalism to that, it would be just, Game of Thrones would be nothing for compared. Just so good. By the way, we have some cannibalism in Game of Thrones. I think we do have some kind of cannibalism. Yeah. Craster, the guy north of the wall. I don't want to give anything away.
Yeah, Craster.
Yeah. So we have a little Game of Thrones got to have a little cannibalism.
And then Ramsey too.
Ramsey, yeah. I'm a little obsessed with Game of Thrones, so you guys may be too busy to watch it, but when you get a chance when you graduate, watch it. It's pretty awesome. Read all the books too. The books are pretty good. But thank God the TV show is actually resolving some plot lines. Only 3 more to go.
I know that's busy.
Yeah, but then there's only more.
Yeah, there'll be more. They're prequels. All right. So remember I told you that there are other types of survival cannibals that probably for the Donner Party, served as a model that they didn't think they needed to hide what they did, and that is survival cannibalism on the sea. So it was very commonly known as sort of the law of the sea that mariners would resort to survival cannibalism in extreme situations. What's the extreme situation? You're out on your boat, the boat crashes, the boat sinks, for some reason you're out in the middle of the sea, you got a life raft, you got a little boat that you're all trying to survive on, and you don't have any rations, and so what you do is you resort to cannibalism. And this is where this whole idea about drawing straws, you guys know about this? Person with the short straw, that's the person who gets killed and eaten, right? So this was a common custom of the sea. Nobody ever questioned this. If people knew about it, nobody ever questioned it. And it had been practiced for hundreds of years. Okay, now you got to remember back in the day, again, before we had, floating, driving couches, motorized couches, and motorized couches on the ocean, of boats that go along the ocean that had motors in them, that sea travel was done via sail. And there was the era of the great sailing ships, roughly from 1500 to middle 1800s when steamships started to become available. This is a long time. So we had 300 years in European history, and if you go back farther than that, you can find other kind of ships before that. But that was the real period of the age of sail. Well, sailing is really great for some reasons. It doesn't use gasoline, so people like sailboats now for that reason. But it's really quite dangerous, and you're quite at the whim of the weather and the waves. And these sailors became really, really very competent at moving these big sailing ships around the world, following the trade winds and knowing when the winds were and being able to read the weather. They're really quite good at it. And by the 1800s, you have people, especially like the British, are really, really, really good at this sailing stuff. But it is still really quite dangerous. And all sorts of things can happen on these wooden sailing ships. They're subject to wind. They get caught in a hurricane. They can catch on fire. They are, many times back in the day, were battling other nations who would, basically come alongside them and, blow them to smithereens with cannonballs. All sorts of stuff happened out in the middle of the sea. It was very unpredictable. And so being lost at sea was a common known thing. And so people knew about this. And people knew about sailors who were lost at sea may have to resort to cannibalism, drawing straws, right? So you pick a short straw, you are the one who's going to eat. So by 1884, by this time you have steamships, but people still have sailing vessels. And I just put this one up as an example because there was a book written about this, Cannibalism in the Common Law. And there is a yacht, a large yacht, that's being sailed from England to Australia. And it's in the South Atlantic, and it's struck by a large rogue wave. Rogue waves, still had rogue waves back then, we have those now. And the boat sank within 5 minutes. And it was so sudden that the professional crew of 4 managed just barely to escape in the ship's dinghy, which dinghy is a small little rowboat. And they only had a chronometer, a sextant, which allows them to navigate 2 tins of turnips, and no fresh water whatsoever. Now, you know that you could go a long time without eating. You might be able to go a month without eating, but you cannot go very long without water. You definitely need water to survive. So water is the more crucial thing. Okay? So again, this is, if you read about these guys who are lost at sea, even modern accounts, you want some way to collect water from rain, because water is the thing that will kill you quicker. Okay? But they don't have much food, very little food, no water. And after 19 days of unspeakable hardship, Captain Dudley and the ship's mate, Stevens, resort to the grim and time-honored solution of killing one so the others may live. Lots were not drawn because they already had a viable candidate, the 17-year-old boy named Parker, who's the ship's boy. He's the obvious choice. He's orphaned. He doesn't have a family. He's illiterate. And he was very near death anyway, having in desperation drunk a large quantity of seawater. Why can't you just drink the ocean water? Why can't you drink ocean water? It's salt water. What does salt water do to your body? It leaches all the water out of you, right? Osmosis, you guys learned about that in high school chemistry. So you can't drink seawater. You could distill seawater into fresh water, but that takes some apparatus. They weren't able to do it. So this guy was near death anyway, so they decided, okay, he's the obvious choice. So kill him they do. It was necessary. They killed him. They wanted to kill him while he was alive. They don't want to wait till he was died because they want his blood to be flowing so they could collect the blood and drink it like water, which is also not a really good idea because blood is also pretty salty. So I don't know about that. I assume blood is probably less salty than salt water, but somebody looked that up. But anyway, that was the idea. So they cut the boy's throat, and they subsisted on his blood and his body until being rescued 5 days later by a passing vessel. Neither to his rescuers nor to the English authorities did Captain Dudley seek to conceal what had happened. As an experienced seaman and ship's master, he knew that he had consciously applied the custom of the sea to circumstances which were distressingly common in the day of sea. He got back to England, and he got charged for murder. He and Stevens were charged in premeditated murder, which carried the mandatory penalty of death. So what happens then, what results from this, if you go to law school, you might learn about this, is a very famous court case. And it's a very good example of how you can sort of weasel out of things as in the judicial system. So there's the ensuing action of Regina, that means the Queen, versus Dudley and Stevens, became a leading case in Anglo-American common law, one that's still cited in courtrooms today. Because it was the first judicial analysis of the defense of necessity. Okay, we had to kill him or we would have died. When the taking of another's life is the sole means to one's survival, is the deed morally justified and legally defensible. Okay. Is there any logical point, let alone any deterrent effect to the applying the common law to an uncommon social situation, which the actors, reduced to something akin to a state of nature, will do what they must do in order to live? The custom of the sea, informed by the realities of shipwreck, judged that Dudley and Stevens had acted properly under the circumstances. The law of the land, informed by Victorian England high-mindedness and a general abhorrence of a legal vacuum, sought conviction under the indictment. The problem facing the presiding and partial judge was that public opinion, he was against it, public opinion was known to be in favor of the accused. A jury acquittal was likely and would in effect declare an open season on cabin boys. So here's the problem, you're the judge, you realize that if you don't send these guys to jail and prosecute them, at any time a captain can say, yeah, I've got enough reason here, we think we need to get rid of the cabin boy to survive. The cabin boys can become a very hazardous profession, right? Because they're the ones that are going to be killed most quickly, right? So the judge is trying to weigh these things. People really have a lot of sympathies for these guys, and it's the custom of the sea, but we don't want to have an open season on cabin boys. So to avoid this, what they do is they have the jury render a special verdict, one which would rule on the facts of the case, but not on the guilt of the defendants. The maneuver threw the case into a higher court, meaning that judge could send it off to somebody else, and making it a lawyer's question to be decided by the Lord Chief Justice and his 4 colleagues on the bench. So basically, this gets thrown to a higher court where it's decided by the judges, not by a jury. Okay? And what they do is they do a little legal maneuvering here. They find the men guilty as charged. So don't do this because you'll be found guilty. But they basically give them They commute their death sentence and give them 6 months in prison. So this is how they do it. And again, this is a legal maneuver you will see sometimes done. They'll find the person guilty, but then they'll charge them $1 as a fine, right? So this is, I think, one of the first cases where they do this sort of thing. They find the person guilty, but then they charge them $1 fine for, you know, for the crime. In this case, they put them in jail for 6 months. They give them a token jail sentence. Okay? A very, very famous case. Any of you going to law school, God rest your soul. Sorry, I come from a family of lawyers. You'll probably read about this case and many other interesting ones like this. But by the 1800s, you know, you now have steam-powered boats. By this time, there's steam-powered boats, and sailing, you know, boat travel becomes a lot safer. Okay, unless you're on the Titanic and you're not paying attention, it becomes a lot safer. Okay, let's talk about some sociological explanations of cannibalism. Sociologists link cannibalism to the expression of cultural values about life, reproduction, regeneration. Human flesh is seen as a life-giving substance, a way of symbolically affirming one's existence. Sometimes the same things are affirmed through animal sacrifice. Cannibalism also may be a way for some groups to maintain their social identity and establish boundaries of their moral community. Right? In other words, I only eat immoral or bad people, okay, who are out of my group. And this is something you typically see when you see some kinds of zombie movies, some kind of vampire movies, the same thing, right? You know, like if you're the vampire Lestat in the Anne Rice world of vampires, you only drink blood of, you know, some certain kind. You typically find bad people and drink their blood, right? You don't typically go drink the blood of good people, right? There's some moral thing, who gets eaten, who doesn't get eaten. It's related to morals, okay? Other sociologists think EXO cannibalism is an expression of hostility, violation, domination toward a victim. Remember, it's the ultimate insult, right? Eat a person and literally turn them into shit. Okay? Both these interpretations obviously are subject to debate. We can move to Sigmund Freud, and Sigmund Freud wrote about cannibalism. It was a key part of his idea about civilization, and he wrote this book called Totem and Taboo. Here's a quote. One day the brothers, the band of brothers living together, killed and devoured their father. These brothers were pissed off because the father was making all these rules and strictures and reining in their behavior. And so they get pissed off, they get band together, and they kill the father and devour him, eat him. Cannibal savages as they were, it goes without saying that they devoured their victim as well as killing him. The totem meal, which is perhaps mankind's earliest festival, would thus be a repetition in commemoration of this memorable and criminal deed, which was the beginnings of so many things, of social organization, of moral restrictions, and of religion. So this story, as it goes, it's very interesting because Freud, essentially this was Freud's fantasy. You don't really have, know of indigenous peoples, tribal peoples who do this sort of thing. They have a totem meal and devour the father. This is something Freud made up in his head. Okay? Maybe he was influenced by Greek myth, which is my thought. But what he's saying here symbolically is very interesting. So symbolically, this is more important and maybe useful than thinking of this as actually a real thing. Totem meal was not really a real thing. But what's going on here is the brothers get together, their behavior's all over the place, they're acting out. The father restricts their behavior, they don't like this, so they kill him. In killing the father, they then incorporate him. They eat him. In this way, you can think about this as a symbolic version of psychological incorporation. Remember I talked to you guys about this earlier with regard to tattoos? You're incorporating the person. You think about this as like you're incorporating their characteristics, like the child would incorporate the mental representation of a parent during development. To me, this is what this symbolizes. And then what happens, once they incorporate the father, they have the band of brothers, there's no father to lead them. So then the brothers then reinstitute all the laws and the strictures that the father was trying to get them to follow. Now they do it, they've incorporated that, and now they've incorporated the father, and now they become responsible for the rules and the strictures on behavior. And so one way to think about this as a metaphor for human development, that you incorporate the mental representation of your parents, especially the superego representations of what's right and wrong, and then at a certain time period you think about this in an Oedipal complex, you have a conflict, you're scared that your father, your mother are going to do something to you because you like the other parent, out of jealousy, but then you resolve that, and the resolution of that could be thought of as killing off the father. In other words, you grow up, you no longer lead the father, but you've now incorporated the mental representations of the father superego, what's right and what's wrong, and then now as a group, you institute this, okay? And for Freud, this was the beginning of civilization. This is how civilizations begin, okay? That this is where our rules and strictures of society come from. They come from this totem feast. But what I like to think of is this, think of it more symbolically. It's sort of a symbolic thing of sort of object relations development. How as infants we absorb, we take in the mental representations of our parents, and as we grow up, we then manifest those things in society. Okay, does that make sense? I think it's really quite fascinating. Very good read, by the way. Good book, good read. And so again, this is another way we could think of cannibalism here as a sort of internal, like a psychological internalization of the qualities of the person being eaten. Now we can think, again, this is related. Two ways of dealing, so one way you can think of is also anxiety caused by the severity of the superego. So what happens when the superego is too strict, okay, too perfectionistic? You know, many more things are wrong than are right, right? So again, you can think of this as the father, totem meal, too many things, there's too many strictures on it, too overpowering. And so this creates a lot of anxiety. You're going around being really anxious because you're always constantly breaking the rules because the rules are too strict. So what may happen here is first, ego may be rent from reality and overwhelmed by the id. Freudians back in the old day would call this a regression to a psychosis. Second, the ego may remain true to reality, but its functioning will be impaired by the superego. Sublimation curtailed by the feeling of thou shalt not. Okay? You sublimate your energy, you want to put it into something constructive, but the superego is telling you, not allowing you to do that. And third, some sort of mediation of superego severity leading to reduction in anxiety. This may entail some sort of identification with the parental objects, a psychological incorporation. This is internalization of the mental representations of the parent. This can be acted out via actual or through a sublimated or symbolic version of cannibalism. Okay? So if you want to think about the Christian church, you know, God the Father, right? God the Father has these strictures. You know, these things you can't do. 10 Commandments, you cannot do these, right? These may be a little strict. So what do is you sort of incorporate some of this. You incorporate that God, the Father, in this case Christianity, via incorporating symbolically the Son, the body of Christ. And then this allows you then to be able to deal with the rules and strictures a little bit more creatively. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So this is very fascinating. I think this is really very interesting. There's a paper by Ella Sharp on sublimation delusion, and she suggests that art can play this role too, that the act of making art is a way of doing this, which is really quite fascinating, very fascinating paper. Now, we can also think about cannibalism, again, from another Freudian view, is oral incorporation. And a lot of this literature comes from when psychoanalysts talk about homosexuality, which unfortunately, back in the day, this is thought to be homosexuality is thought to be a pathology. Okay, so we know nowadays, and I want to point this out, that we don't consider homosexual identifications, homosexual sexual identification, as pathological, just like we don't consider heterosexual sexual identification as pathological anymore. However, you may find lots of pathology expressed through, for instance, heterosexual acts. We talked a lot about this. Vampires, oral sadistic aggression, right? Acted out sexually, okay? Just like you can find lots of pathology exemplified through heterosexual acts, you can find some pathologies exemplified through homosexual acts. It does not mean people who have a homosexual identity are pathological. It just means, just like any sexual behavior, homosexual behavior can be tied to a certain kind of pathology. Does that make sense? So this is very important to know. So this is a way of saying, no, homosexuals aren't abnormal. It's everybody's abnormal to some degree. We all have pathologies, right? Especially according to Freud, we're all neurotic. So some of these neuroses can be acted out via our sexuality, regardless of how you identify sexually. Does that make sense? And so we can see, so it's my modern interpretation of some of this older psychoanalytic literature on homosexuality has to do with the pathology driving the behavior, not the behavior being something that's pathological. Does that make sense? I wrote about this in my book, so when you read my book for free, you can read about this. Okay? And so in some situations, you might find homosexual acts, like oral sex, as an attempt to satisfy a cannibalistic wish to bite off the partner's penis and incorporate it. And the idea is that this would allow the person to regain endangered masculinity. Okay? So maybe somebody is overly controlled by the mother. They feel they've sort of been, infantilized, or they might feel overly controlled by the father or castrated by the father. And so one way that they deal with those feelings is to engage in this homosexual behavior and incorporate a male partner's penis, so symbolically giving them that masculinity which has been denied them. Okay? Does that mean that all homosexuals do this? No. Okay, does that make sense? Good. Another guy more recently named Socarides, Charles Socarides, wrote a book on homosexuality in 1978. Again, if he shows up in San Francisco to give a talk, there will be people protesting outside, along with protesting my dad about his paper on transgender people. But because I think they're mistaking the map for the territory. Okay, that's how I look at it. And a bunch of people have written about these kind of things. The wish to eat the father's testicles was a motivating force in homosexuality. This comes from 1909. Biebring in 1940 concludes a homosexual tries to regain his endangered lost masculinity by an oral attack on his partner's penis in order to acquire it. Well, okay, maybe. You can also see this behavior also in heterosexual behavior. Okay? Especially if you believe in penis envy, right? So you have the same thing. There's probably a male version, probably a womb envy version of this. So, all sorts of things that we can make here. I would not personally pick on homosexuals with this. I would just say there's a lot of sexual pathology issues probably having to do with eating things, oral incorporation, right? And imagine that you also think about Freud's developmental stages. You're stuck in the oral stage. You got to nail everything, looks like a hammer. You're stuck in the oral stage. You just want to stick things in your mouth, okay? People used to constantly talk about the oral personality, person smoking cigarettes, only wanting to have oral sex, wanting, kind of obsessed with eating things, the sort of oral personality kind of person. Okay, so a lot of ways you could get into this and talk about this. We don't have time here to get into all of it, but again, Freudian psychology is really, really a gold mine for looking at cannibalism. And again, we can talk about oral aggression. Okay. Cannibalism understood as a psychological response to anger and frustration. Anger and frustration expressed via oral aggression. In other words, it becomes literally an urge to absorb someone by eating them. This is a lot of times directed at somebody who's threatening. For children who are extremely dependent, this can be directed toward the mother, who may be overbearing and over-nurturing. As adults, these children are more likely to express oral aggressive urges against women through cannibalism. And again, I think you could probably write a great paper and look at womb envy going on here. So if somebody wants to do a good paper for graduate school, this is a good idea. Okay? This pattern, by the way, has been seen in some serial killers who ate their victims. Other experts debate this explanation and claim that oral aggression associated with cannibalism is triggered by some sort of traumatic stress. So other psychologists explain that cannibals have had some sort of trauma around weaning from the breast, causing rage and oral aggression that results in wanting to devour their mother. Okay, so all these things come up. But one of the great stories, fairy tales, expressing this is, of course, Little Red Riding Hood. What happens in Little Red Riding Hood? Little Red Riding Hood is going along. She's an innocent little girl, but now maybe perhaps she is undergoing some sort of sexual awakening. And then the big bad wolf shows up, eats the grandmother, and waits for her and wants to eat her up too. So you can make all sorts of great Freudian interpretations of this story around oral aggression. Okay, so this is really good. You can take your choice. All sorts of ways you could look at this thing. But again, centering around oral aggression and sexuality to some degree. Okay? We can also look at cannibalism as a psychological issue, pure psychological issue. And again, we find in lots of cannibal people that a lot of them have some sort of delusional, some psychotic level delusion. And of course, a good poster boy for this is Jeffrey Dahmer. You guys know about Jeffrey Dahmer. He was a guy who would lure young men back to his apartment, kill them and eat them. And one got away, called the cops. They found Dahmer's apartment full of stuff in the refrigerator, all sorts of bodies and things, and put him in prison. And one day in prison, he happened to be sent to the wrong place, the non-protected part of the prison, and the prisoners made short work of him. That probably was done on purpose. Okay. Serial killers like this, homosexual serial killers, don't do well in prison. Okay? But Dahmer fantasized about eating people from when he was a child. Okay? And he had a really messed up childhood, alcoholic parents. There's a really good comic book about this by a guy named John Backdurf, who's a comic, who wrote this comic book, My Friend Dahmer, because he grew up with Dahmer, was high school friends with Dahmer. And this comic book is great. And I used to put the whole thing up, and I realized that Backdurf makes his living writing comics, and so I felt really bad giving this away for free. So I said to put this thing up here. You can go in here, and I think $3 you can get the comic book. So support this guy. He's a really good comic. It's a really good story. It's really interesting. Give you all the background about Dahmer, but certainly his early childhood upbringing had something to do with what was going on. And the funny thing is, he says in the comic that people basically voted Dahmer as most likely to grow up and become a serial killer because they knew he was weird. He was weird and acted weird. So again, a lot of times people kind of know, that one guy, in the class, that guy, that's guy, watch him, right? Very interesting. So I recommend this. I didn't give you my lectures on zombies, but of course zombies have a lot of oral aggressive themes, a lot of cannibalistic themes in zombies. There are many zombie and cannibalistic movies out there that have this oral aggression sort of theme. Oral aggression makes us mindless. So this is the sort of the takeaway message of zombie movies. You get bit by the zombie, you get infected by this oral aggression, and now you just blindly go and eat and incorporate things without thinking more. So oral aggression is something that makes us mindless. Okay? Makes us mindless. But like the Maenads, remember the Maenads? You would go and eat anybody who would wander into the forest. The Maenads, like the mainlands, this mindless. There is some gratification from this eating. Right? There's gratification from this mindless eating, but basically it just leads to more need for more oral aggression, for more eating. Zombies never get full. Right? You ever watch The Walking Dead? Zombies eat some people up, and they go, I'm done now. I'm going to go take a nap, right? No. The zombies constantly eating, right? Even when the torso is gone, they're dragging themselves along the ground. They're trying to orally incorporate and eat you, right? So again, this is this mindless oral aggression, right? So again, when you're in a society that is messed up, things are going bad, this mindless oral aggression is something that might be a societal response, because we see that, when things go bad, the economy goes bad, the searches for zombies go up. So there may be some relationship between oral aggression and things going on in society. Again, great subject for a doctoral dissertation. So again, I encourage you, if you're thinking of going on to school, think about some of these things. Again, you can read my book, because there's a similar dynamic to this oral aggression that you see in zombies, right? This mindless oral aggression. It's a similar dynamic to drug addiction, right? That you have this. When a lot of drugs are orally incorporated. You incorporate the drug, you get certain feelings out of it. The feelings go away, and you got to get more of it, right? You got to orally incorporate more and more and more, right? And it becomes sort of a vicious cycle. And so this can be very similar to sort of the psychology that you find behind drug addiction. You want to know about this? You can read my book. By the way, celebrity endorsement here by Michael Dorn. Michael Dorn's the guy who played Worf in the Star Trek movies. Here he is reading my book. So just you got to have a celebrity endorsement for your book. So I got a Star Trek celebrity endorsement. So there you go. But again, much like the myth of Dionysus that I talked to you about already. And again, now you can read for free. So go, if you're interested in this, you can read my book and come and talk to me about it. So I think I want to end here with talking about cannibalism as a psychological issue, that many people that we find engaging in cannibalism may have some kind of psychosis, schizophrenia or some kind of psychosis. And again, we see this with many cannibal criminal murderers, people like Albert Fish and Edward Gein. Edward Gein was the guy who killed his mother and made a skin suit out of her. And I think he did some cannibalism. Albert Fish, another similar kind of guy. Also, people who engage in auto-cannibalism tend to be diagnosed as psychosis. Now, by the way, this is a still from a film. Anybody know the film? The film called Cannibal Holocaust. It is the archetype of exploitation movies, Italian exploitation movies. It's a film about some explorers who go to down the Amazon basin, and they are horrible people, and they are racist and all these kind of horrible things, but then they encounter these cannibal tribes, and you can guess what happens to them at the end. It is one of the most gory, gross movies ever made. If Dr. Bushman and I ever have our class on exploitation films, we will definitely show this. Last I checked, there was a full version of it up on YouTube, if anybody wants some gory film watching this weekend. Very interesting movie, lots of social themes around this movie about racism and other things. Yes?
Is that the movie where after it was done and like in theaters, where people were like, okay, is this person actually dead? And they had to be like, no, they're not dead. This person's still alive.
Yeah, so what happened after the movie, very good, glad you asked that question. So what happened after the movie is that they took the actors, some of the main actors who got killed in the movie, and they put them into hiding. And then people said, oh my God, you know, these people were really killed in the movie, and the promoters and everything really built that up, you know, like, yeah, well, we're not going to tell you whether it's real or not, but these people are gone now, like, oh my God, they really were killed. It came to the point where they actually, the authorities got involved and started investigating, and they had to say, no, we just hid them away for a couple months. It was a publicity stunt. And they came out, but people would leave the film like throwing up and you know, totally grossed out. So it had this big splash, you know, and so that was done as like a publicity stunt thing. But yes, that's actually what happened in this movie. There's a sequel movie too. Also, the movie uses found footage, which is a first in cinematography to use found footage. They didn't do much of that. I mean, they did that back in the 20s and 30s too, but it's the first sort of modern movie to use found footage. So you can look at that. So again, if we ever do that class, we'll show this movie, but you'll have to watch it on your own for now. And the last thing I want to talk about is auto-cannibalism. When you see auto-cannibalism, somebody eating parts of themselves, usually there is psychosis involved. Okay, usually some form of psychosis involved. And here's a bunch of case histories here. You can read about this. People talk about that. And what do the people cut off? People tend to eat things they can cut off, right? So fingers, toes, penises get cut off a lot. You know, the voices are telling you to cut off the penis and eat it. You can see those kind of things. Okay? So I think that's about all I have to say. These, by the way, these are ladyfinger cookies that are made just like 3 fingers. So I couldn't find any of those. I was going to bring those in too, but sorry, couldn't find any.